I'll never forget the weight of that envelope. The thick manila paper, the sharp smell of toner, the bold black letters that screamed, "Notice of lawsuit, trespassing." The mailbox lid slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the quiet Tuesday afternoon. Cold October air bit at my fingers as I stood there, staring at the return address. Pinebrook Estates, Homeowners Association, Visu, Michael Chen. My own name stared back at me like an accusation. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, pregnant with malice and bureaucratic arrogance. I could practically smell the smugness seeping through the paper fibers. My pulse hammered against my temples as I tore it open right there on my driveway, pages fluttering in the autumn breeze. Defendant is hereby notified that he has unlawfully trespassed upon association property on multiple occasions. The words blurred together in a haze of legal jargon and manufactured outrage. They were suing me for trespassing on my own property. The audacity was breathtaking, even for them. I read it again, slower this time, letting each ridiculous claim sink in. According to their version of reality, I had willfully and maliciously stepped onto community-owned land adjacent to my fence line. They claimed I had damaged association property by walking near the mailbox cluster. Most laughably, they accused me of intimidating association members simply by existing in my own yard. The autumn sun felt suddenly cold against my face. Around me, the neighborhood hummed with its usual suburban quiet. The distant drone of a leaf blower, the soft whistle of wind through the oak trees, the muffled sound of a television from the Henderson house next door. Normal sounds from a normal Tuesday afternoon. But nothing felt normal anymore. Their arrogance dripped from every line of that lawsuit like poison from a wound. Karen Whitmore's signature appeared at the bottom as HOA president, her penmanship sharp and aggressive, the K slashing across the page like a blade. Tom Bradley, the treasurer, had co-signed with his usual flourish, that pretentious curl he added to his T that made me want to laugh every time I saw it. Diane Foster's name appeared as secretary, her signature small and cramped, like she was already trying to hide. I could picture them in their little conference room above the community center, gathered around that cheap folding table with their manila folders and their self-important expressions. Karen would have been pacing, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor, painting me as some kind of neighborhood menace who needed to be stopped. Tom would have been nodding along, adjusting his gold watch, the one he loved to flash whenever he talked about property values and community standards. And Diane would have been taking notes in her careful handwriting, documenting every spiteful word for their official records. The paper crinkled in my tightening grip. 3 months of harassment had led to this moment. 3 months of threatening letters, surprise inspections, and whispered conversations that stopped whenever I walked by. 3 months of their systematic campaign to make my life miserable. And now they thought they had me cornered. I walked slowly back toward my house, the lawsuit pages rustling in my hand like dead leaves. My neighbor's windows seemed to watch me, curtains twitching slightly, faces barely visible behind the glass. The whole street felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The Hendersons' blinds snapped shut as I passed. Mrs. Patterson quickly turned away from her mailbox, her movements stiff with manufactured urgency. Even old Mr. Garcia, who used to wave every morning, suddenly found something fascinating about his garden hose that required his immediate attention. Fear had infected Pinebrook Estates like a virus, and the HOA board was the source. They had turned neighbors into informants, friends into strangers, and a peaceful community into a surveillance state ruled by petty bureaucrats, drunk on their tiny portion of power. I reached my front door and paused, key in hand, feeling the weight of their lawsuit pressing down on my shoulders. Behind me, I could sense the neighborhood watching, waiting for me to crumble under the pressure. Karen probably expected me to come crawling to the next board meeting, hat in hand, begging for mercy and promising to stay in line. The thought made me smile for the first time all day. I slipped the key into the lock and stepped inside. The familiar smell of home washing over me, coffee from this morning's pot, the faint scent of the cedar candle my sister had given me last Christmas, the subtle mustiness of old books lining my living room shelves. This was my sanctuary, the place I had saved for years to buy, the first real home I had ever owned, and they thought they could take it away from me with a piece of paper. I set the lawsuit down on my kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Through the window above my sink, I could see Karen's house across the street, a pristine colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping, and a proud HOA board member sign planted prominently in her front yard. Her living room light was on, and I could see her silhouette moving back and forth behind the curtains, pacing, probably, planning her victory celebration, imagining how she would savor my defeat at the next community meeting. I took a long drink of water and let the cool liquid calm the fire in my chest. They thought they had cornered me. They thought their little lawsuit would crush my spirit and send me fleeing from Pinebrook Estates with my tail between my legs. What they didn't know was that my real weapon fit neatly into my back pocket. 6 months earlier, I had fallen in love with 847 Maple Ridge Drive the moment I stepped out of my realtor's car. The smell of pine trees at dawn hung in the air like a promise, mixed with the earthy scent of mulch and the faint sweetness of blooming dogwoods. The quiet hum of cicadas provided a natural soundtrack to what felt like paradise after years of cramped apartment living in the city. The house itself was modest but perfect, a 2-story colonial U, with cedar shingles weathered to a soft gray, surrounded by mature oaks that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns across the lawn. The backyard stretched out like a green canvas, bordered by a simple wooden fence that gave way to a small wooded area where deer would sometimes emerge in the early morning to graze. "This is it," I had whispered to myself, standing on the front porch and breathing in the freedom of space. No more neighbors banging on walls at 3 in the morning. No more sirens wailing past my bedroom window. No more fighting for a parking spot on streets lined with broken glass and discarded fast food containers. This was supposed to be my escape, my reward for 15 years of hard work and careful saving, the place where I could finally plant roots and build the quiet life I had always dreamed of. The HOA, however, had other plans. I should have paid more attention to the fine print in those disclosure documents, should have asked more questions about the community, standards, and architectural guidelines, should have wondered why my realtor's smile had seemed just a little too bright when she mentioned the Active and Engaged Homeowners Association. Within 2 weeks of moving in, I received my first notice. "Dear new resident, welcome to Pinebrook Estates. Please be advised that your grass height currently exceeds community standards. Grass must be maintained at no more than 2.5 inches in height. Please remedy this violation within 72 hours or face a $50 fine." I had laughed at first. Actually laughed. My grass was maybe 3 inches tall, a healthy green carpet that any suburban homeowner would be proud of. But according to Karen Whitmore's carefully typed letter, those extra half inches represented a threat to property values and community harmony. The laughter died when the fine arrived 3 days later. Then came the fence color controversy. The simple wooden fence that had charmed me during the house tour was apparently not in compliance with current aesthetic guidelines. The natural cedar finish that blended beautifully with the surrounding trees was unapproved staining that required immediate correction. Tom Bradley personally delivered that notice, his gold watch catching the afternoon sunlight as he handed me the official-looking document. His smile was all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a man who enjoyed wielding power over others. "Nothing personal, Mike," he had said, using the familiar name I had never given him permission to use. "But we all have to follow the rules. That's what makes this such a special place to live." The special place to live turned out to be a cage disguised as paradise. Within a month, I had received violations for parking my perfectly legal sedan too close to the street curb, for hanging laundry on a clothesline in my own backyard, and for the cardinal sin of leaving my garbage can visible from the street for more than 4 hours after pickup. Each violation came with its own fine, its own threatening language, and its own impossible deadline for compliance. But the real poison wasn't in the letters. It was in what they did to the community itself. Neighbors who had initially welcomed me with warm smiles and offers of homemade cookies began to avoid eye contact. The friendly waves stopped. Conversations ended abruptly when I approached. Children were called inside when I worked in my yard, as if my presence carried some kind of contagion. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow next door, had explained it to me in whispers during one of our early morning encounters at the mailbox cluster. "They keep lists," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "The board, I mean. Lists of who talks to troublemakers, who supports the wrong people, who asks too many questions at meetings. Cross them, and suddenly your deck repair needs special approval. Your tree removal gets denied. Your guest parking gets restricted." Her hands shook as she sorted through her mail, the papers rustling like autumn leaves. My grandson wanted to visit for a week last summer. The board said his motorcycle was inappropriate for the community aesthetic. Had to make him park 3 blocks away and walk. I watched the fear in her eyes, the way she kept checking to make sure no one was listening. This sweet grandmother, who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, was terrified of her own homeowners association. "How did it get this bad?" I asked. Mrs. Patterson's laugh was bitter. "Karen Whitmore," she said simply. "Been board president for 6 years now. Tom and Diane do whatever she says. They've turned this place into their personal kingdom." The blinds twitched at Karen's house across the street, and Mrs. Patterson immediately straightened up, her whole demeanor changing. "Well, I should get inside," she said loudly, as if performing for an audience. "Have a nice day, Mr. Chen." She hurried away, leaving me standing alone at the mailbox cluster, surrounded by the suffocating silence of a community living in fear. The campaign against me escalated steadily. Karen began appearing in my yard at random times, clipboard in hand, documenting imaginary violations with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. Her sharp voice would carry across the street as she dictated notes to herself about unauthorized landscaping, modifications, and improper window treatments. Tom made a habit of driving slowly past my house, his window down, his expensive camera visible on the passenger seat. He never tried to hide what he was doing. The surveillance was part of the intimidation. Let everyone see that the board was watching, always watching. And Diane, snake-like Diane, cultivated her network of informants with whispered conversations and meaningful glances. She would appear at neighbors' doors with plates of brownies and casual questions about what they had observed. Who was working in their yard after hours? Who had visitors parking in the guest spaces? Who seemed unhappy with the current board leadership? The isolation tightened around me like a noose. Friends from work stopped accepting invitations to visit after hearing about the parking restrictions and guest policies. My sister flew in for a weekend and left early, disturbed by the hostile atmosphere and the way neighbors watched our every move from behind their curtains. Even the simple pleasure of sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee became a trial. Karen's living room window faced directly toward my house, and I could feel her eyes on me every time I stepped outside. Sometimes she would make notes on her ever-present clipboard. Sometimes she would take photos with that same expensive camera Tom used for his surveillance drives. The message was clear: you don't belong here. We will make your life miserable until you leave. But they had made one crucial mistake in their campaign of harassment. They assumed I was just another victim, another neighbor who would eventually break under the pressure of their petty tyranny. What they didn't know was that I had walked into their game blind, armed with nothing but good intentions and a naive belief in community, spirit. But they had walked into mine without knowing who they were really dealing with. The campaign began in earnest 3 weeks after my fence color. Citation was officially resolved with a $1,000 professional staining job. I should have known the peace wouldn't last. Karen struck first, as she always did. I was checking my mail on a humid Thursday evening when I heard the sharp click of her camera lens behind me. The sound cut through the summer air like a gunshot, followed immediately by the mechanical whir of the autofocus adjusting. I turned slowly to find her standing at the edge of my driveway, that expensive Nikon raised to her eye like a weapon. "Just documenting," she said without lowering the camera. Her voice carried that particular tone of false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "You appear to be standing on community property." I looked down at my feet, planted firmly on the concrete pad where the mailbox cluster sat. The same concrete pad where every resident of Maple Ridge Drive had stood thousands of times over the years to collect their mail. "This is where the mailboxes are located," I said, keeping my voice level. "Same place they've always been." Another click. Another whir. She adjusted her position, crouching slightly to get what she apparently considered a better angle of my criminal mailbox access. "The property survey shows that this concrete pad extends 3 inches beyond the approved community access zone," she said, consulting a manila folder tucked under her arm. "Any resident standing on the outer edge is technically trespassing on association property." The absurdity was breathtaking, even for Karen. She had apparently commissioned a survey, at community expense, no doubt, to determine the exact legal boundaries of the mailbox access area, all so she could manufacture a trespassing violation against me. I stepped backward, off the concrete entirely, and retrieved my mail from the grass. Karen's camera followed my movement, documenting this retreat as if it were an admission of guilt. "Smart choice," she said, finally lowering the Nikon. Her lipstick was perfectly applied despite the heat, sharp red lines that never seemed to smudge or fade. "I'd hate to have to file another violation report." She walked away with that particular stride of hers, heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to judgment. Behind her trailed the cloying scent of her perfume, something floral and overpowering that seemed to linger in the air long after she was gone. That night, I found the first threatening letter slipped under my door. "Dear Mr. Chen, it has come to the board's attention that you continue to access community property in violation of clearly established boundaries. This behavior constitutes trespassing under both association bylaws and state law. Continued violations will result in legal action." The paper was expensive, with the HOA letterhead embossed in gold. Even their harassment came with a touch of pretentiousness. Tom escalated things the following week. I was trimming the hedge along my fence line when his car pulled up to the curb. Not his usual slow surveillance drive, but a deliberate stop with the engine idling and the window down. He sat there for nearly 10 minutes, just watching me work, that camera of his resting on the window frame like a rifle in a sniper's nest. Every snip of my hedge trimmers seemed to trigger a photo. Adjust the ladder, click. Move to the next section, click. Pause to wipe sweat from my forehead. Click. Finally, he called out across the lawn. "Careful with that fence line, Mike," he said, his tone carrying the false concern of a predator offering help to its prey. "Wouldn't want any of those clippings to fall on association property." I looked at the narrow strip of grass between my fence and the street. The same strip where every homeowner on the block piled their yard waste for weekly pickup. The same strip where kids dropped their bicycles and where residents parked their cars when their driveways were full. "Are you suggesting I need permission to maintain my own landscaping?" I asked. Tom's smile was all teeth and calculation. "Just saying it would be unfortunate if we had to cite you for dumping yard waste on community property. Those fines can really add up." He drove away slowly, making sure I saw him glance back through his rearview mirror. The message was clear. We're watching. We're waiting. We're documenting everything. The psychological pressure was relentless and carefully orchestrated. They had turned the simple act of living in my own home into a minefield of potential violations. Every step outside required careful consideration. Every interaction with neighbors became charged with the possibility of being reported to the board. Diane worked the shadows, as always. She would appear at neighbors' doors in the early evening, when people were home from work but before dinner preparation began. I could see her through my kitchen window, moving from house to house like a missionary, spreading some twisted gospel of surveillance and suspicion. The Hendersons got a visit on Tuesday, the Pattersons on Wednesday, the Garcias on Thursday. Each conversation followed the same pattern: the exchange of pleasantries, the offering of baked goods, the gradual shift to more serious topics. Mrs. Patterson later told me, in whispered fragments during chance encounters, what these visits were really about. "She asks questions," the elderly woman explained, glancing nervously toward Diane's house. "Casual at first. How are you enjoying the neighborhood? Have you noticed any problems lately? Any concerns about property maintenance?" Mrs. Patterson's hands trembled as she sorted through her mail, the same nervous gesture I had come to recognize in all the neighbors. Then it gets more specific. "Have you seen anyone violating parking rules? Any unauthorized modifications to homes? Any residents who seem resistant to community standards?" The fear in her voice was palpable. Diane wasn't just gathering information, she was recruiting informants, building a network of neighbors who would watch and report on each other out of fear of becoming targets themselves. "She makes it clear that cooperation is expected," Mrs. Patterson continued, "that the board remembers who helps maintain community harmony and who doesn't. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Comply with our surveillance state, or become our next target." The campaign reached its crescendo during the monthly HOA meeting in September. I had attended every meeting since moving in, partly out of civic duty and partly to keep track of what new torments they were planning. The meetings were held in the community center, a generic building that smelled of industrial carpet and bitter coffee, furnished with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Karen ran these meetings like a dictator holding court. She sat at the head of a folding table, her gavel ready to silence any dissent, her manila folders arranged in perfect rows like ammunition for the battles to come. This particular meeting had drawn a larger crowd than usual. Nearly 30 residents packed into the small room, the air thick with tension and unspoken grievances. Word had spread that Karen intended to propose new security measures to address what she called ongoing compliance issues. I took my usual seat in the back, noting how other residents avoided the chairs near me as if proximity to the board's current target might make them targets themselves. Karen called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, the sound echoing through the room like gunshots. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I want to address a serious matter that affects the safety and security of our entire community." She stood up, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor as she moved to the front of the room. Tom and Diane flanked her like faithful lieutenants, their expressions grave and self-important. "We have a resident," Karen continued, her eyes scanning the room before settling directly on me, "who has repeatedly violated community property boundaries despite multiple warnings and official citations." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned in my direction. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This individual, she said the word like a curse, has shown complete disregard for our bylaws, our authority, and the rights of his neighbors. He has trespassed on association property. He has damaged community assets. He has created an atmosphere of hostility and non-compliance that threatens the very foundation of what makes Pinebrook Estates special. The lies rolled off her tongue with practiced ease. Each accusation was technically based on some grain of truth. I had stood on that concrete mailbox pad. I had trimmed my hedge near the property line. I had questioned their authority, but twisted into something sinister and threatening. Therefore, Karen announced, her voice rising with theatrical indignation, the board has voted unanimously to pursue all legal remedies available to protect this community from further harassment and trespassing. She pulled out a document I recognized immediately. The same lawsuit papers I would receive in my mailbox. 3 weeks later, Michael Chen, she said, speaking my name like an indictment. You are hereby served with notice of legal action for repeated trespassing on association property, destruction of community assets, and intimidation of board members in the lawful execution of their duties. The room erupted. Gasps of shock mixed with whispers of disbelief. Some neighbors looked horrified by the escalation. Others nodded in approval, apparently convinced by Karen's performance that I posed some kind of genuine threat to their suburban paradise. I sat in stunned silence, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on me. This was their master stroke, public humiliation designed to make me a pariah in my own neighborhood. They weren't just suing me, they were making a spectacle of it, turning me into an example for anyone else who might consider challenging their authority. Karen's smile was triumphant as she returned to her seat, the lawsuit papers still clutched in her perfectly manicured fingers. Tom adjusted his gold watch with satisfaction. Diane made notes on her clipboard, probably documenting the moment for their official records. Are there any questions about this matter? Karen asked, her gavel poised to silence any support I might receive. The room remained eerily quiet. Neighbors who had lived here for years, who had their own stories of HOA harassment and overreach, said nothing. Fear had paralyzed them all. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of their stares, the pressure of their expectations. They wanted me to crumble, to beg for mercy, to provide them with the complete victory they craved. Instead, I simply nodded once and walked toward the door. "Mr. Chen," Karen called after me, her voice sharp with authority. "The board expects a response to these serious charges." I paused at the door and turned back to face the room. Karen sat at her folding table like a queen on her throne, surrounded by her court of enablers and informants. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, making her smile look more like a grimace. "You'll get your response," I said quietly. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but I could feel the impact of those words rippling through the room like stones thrown into still water. They thought they had cornered me. They thought their public humiliation and legal threats would finally crush my resistance and send me fleeing from their perfect little kingdom. But every insult Karen had hurled, every lie she had told, every moment of intimidation and harassment, I had written it down, logged it, and filed it away, because soon all of it would be evidence. Here's what they never imagined while they measured fence lines and drafted their petty lawsuits. I carried something far heavier than their HOA bylaws in my back pocket. The badge itself was deceptively simple. A piece of metal, smaller than a credit card, its surface polished to a mirror shine that caught light like a promise. But that metallic glint represented something that transcended their neighborhood power games. The full authority of the United States federal government. Special Agent Michael Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For 15 years, I had carried that badge through the darkest corners of American crime. white-collar fraud cases that unraveled million-dollar Ponzi schemes, public corruption investigations that toppled mayors and city council members, financial crimes that sent CEOs to federal prison for decades. The weight of it in my pocket was familiar, comforting, a reminder of the real authority that existed beyond Karen's gavel and Tom's gold watch. While they played their petty games of suburban dominance, I had spent my career dismantling criminal enterprises that would have terrified them into sleepless nights. I had bought the house in Pine Brook Estates specifically to escape that world. After 15 years of surveillance operations, undercover assignments, and courtroom testimony that put dangerous people behind bars, I wanted nothing more than the quiet anonymity of suburban life. I wanted to mow my lawn on Saturday mornings, wave to neighbors, and never again have to worry about whether the man behind me in the grocery store line was carrying a weapon or a grudge. The irony was not lost on me that I had fled from real criminals only to find myself surrounded by a different kind of predator, petty bureaucrats, drunk on their tiny portion of power, terrorizing their neighbors with the same systematic cruelty I had seen in organized crime families. But there were crucial differences that Karen, Tom, and Diane had failed to recognize. Real criminals understood consequences. They knew that their actions carried genuine risks, that law enforcement agencies with real power were always watching, always building cases against them. That knowledge made them careful, calculating, disciplined in their cruelty. The HOA board, on the other hand, believed they were untouchable. They had created their own little kingdom, where their word was law, where their authority was absolute, where their victims had no recourse except compliance or exile. They had grown sloppy in their arrogance, leaving trails of evidence that would have made my FBI colleagues laugh with disbelief. Every threatening letter they had sent me was signed and dated, creating a clear paper trail of harassment. Every photograph Karen had taken during her surveillance campaigns was time-stamped and geotagged, proving a pattern of stalking behavior. Every board meeting where they had publicly humiliated residents was recorded in official minutes, documenting their abuse of authority. They had been building a federal case against themselves without even realizing it. Because what they had done to me, and what Mrs. Patterson's whispered stories suggested they had done to other residents, wasn't just HOA overreach. It was a systematic campaign of harassment, intimidation, and potentially illegal surveillance targeting someone who happened to be a federal law enforcement officer. That badge in my pocket wasn't just symbolic. It represented jurisdiction that extended far beyond their community bylaws, authority that superseded their board positions, and resources they couldn't begin to comprehend. While Karen was taking photographs of me standing near my own mailbox, I was mentally cataloging each incident as potential evidence of stalking and harassment of a federal officer. While Tom was making his surveillance drives past my house, I was documenting times, dates, and license plate numbers for a pattern of behavior analysis that would make their petty intimidation tactics look like what they really were: criminal activity. And while Diane was building her network of neighborhood informants, I was recognizing the classic structure of an intimidation conspiracy, the same kind of organized harassment I had seen in mob neighborhoods and corrupt political machines. The most beautiful part was that they had done it all to themselves. I hadn't revealed my profession to anyone in the neighborhood, hadn't flashed my badge or mentioned my law enforcement background or made any threats about federal jurisdiction. I had simply tried to live quietly in my new home, responding to their harassment with the patience of someone who had dealt with far more dangerous adversaries. But their lawsuit had changed everything. The moment they filed those papers in court, claiming I had trespassed and intimidated them, they had made it a matter of official legal record. They had dragged a federal law enforcement officer into their local court system based on manufactured charges and fabricated evidence. That wasn't just harassment anymore. That was interference with a federal officer in the performance of his duties. Even off-duty federal officers are protected under federal statutes. It was abuse of process. It was conspiracy to deprive someone of their civil rights under color of authority. It was a whole catalog of federal crimes that carried penalties far more serious than their $50 grass-height fines. I pulled the badge from my pocket and held it up to the afternoon light streaming through my kitchen window. The federal eagle caught the sun, its wings spread wide, its talons gripping the scales of justice. Beneath it, the words that struck fear into the hearts of real criminals. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Karen's house was visible through that same window, her living room light glowing warm and welcoming. I could see her silhouette moving back and forth, probably planning her victory celebration. For the lawsuit she was so confident would destroy me, if she had bothered to do any research on her target, the kind of basic background investigation that any competent HOA board should conduct. Before declaring war on a resident, she would have discovered some interesting facts about her new neighbor. She would have learned that Special Agent Michael Chen had a 15-year track record of taking down criminal conspiracies much more sophisticated than her neighborhood harassment campaign. She would have discovered that I had testified in federal court dozens of times, my credibility established and unshakable. She would have realized that I had resources, connections, and legal authority that extended far beyond her community center conference room. Most importantly, she would have understood that their lawsuit wasn't just flawed. It was a direct attack on the United States government itself, because when you sue a federal agent for doing nothing more than living peacefully in his own home, when you manufacture evidence and coordinate harassment campaigns against someone carrying a federal badge, you're not just picking a fight with your neighbor, you're picking a fight with the system that puts real criminals in federal prison. The badge felt warm in my palm, heated by the afternoon sun, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice was about to be served. For 15 years, I had used this authority to protect innocent people from predators who thought their power made them untouchable. Now I was going to use it to protect my neighbors from predators who had turned their own community into a prison of fear and intimidation. Karen, Tom, and Diane had spent months building their case against me, collecting their evidence, preparing their legal strategy. They thought they were the hunters and I was the prey. They were about to learn what it felt like to be investigated by someone who had spent his entire career perfecting the art of taking down criminals who believed they were above the law, and I was ready to let them dig their graves as deep as they wanted. The resistance began in whispers. Mrs. Patterson was the first to approach me, 3 days after the community center confrontation. I was working in my front garden when I heard her soft voice calling from the hedge that separated our properties. "Michael?" Her voice was barely above a murmur, almost lost in the rustle of autumn leaves. "Could you help me with something in my backyard? Away from the street?" I found her waiting behind her garden shed, wringing her hands like a conspirator preparing to share state secrets. The afternoon shadows provided cover from the watching windows of Karen's house, but Mrs. Patterson still kept glancing nervously toward the street. "I saw what they did to you at the meeting," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "It's not right. None of this is right." She pulled a manila folder from beneath her cardigan, thin, worn pages that rustled with the sound of long-buried secrets. "I've been keeping records," she whispered. "Everything they've done to me, to others. I thought maybe someday someone would care enough to listen." The folder contained a heartbreaking catalog of HOA tyranny spanning 6 years, violation notices for window boxes that were allegedly too colorful, fines for hanging Christmas lights that extended 2 inches beyond approved guidelines, threatening letters about her grandson's motorcycle visits that escalated from warnings to final notices to legal action in the span of 3 weeks. But the most damning documents were the financial records Mrs. Patterson had meticulously tracked every fine, every fee, every special assessment levied by the board. The numbers told a story of systematic targeting. Her violations always seemed to coincide with months when she couldn't afford to pay immediately. The late fees compounded with mathematical precision. The payment plans came with punitive interest rates that would have made a loan shark blush. "They broke my fixed income," she said, tears forming in her rheumy eyes. $500 in fines last year alone. For what? For living in my own home. But the financial harassment was only part of the story. At the bottom of the folder were photographs, grainy, secretive images taken through her kitchen window. Karen and Tom standing in her backyard without permission. Karen measuring her fence height with a ruler. Tom photographing her outdoor furniture, her garden decorations, her trash cans placed for collection. "They come when they think I'm not home," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Walk right through my gate like they own the place. Take pictures of everything. Make notes on their clipboards." The pattern was clear and legally significant. The board was conducting warrantless searches of private property, using their HOA authority as justification for what amounted to criminal trespassing. "Mrs. Patterson," I said gently, "would you be willing to write down everything you remember about these incidents? Times, dates, exactly what they said and did?" Her eyes widened with a mixture of hope and terror. You think someone might actually do something about them?" "I think their day of reckoning is coming," I told her. Word spread through the underground network of HOA victims faster than I had expected. The Hendersons approached me 2 days later during my evening walk. Jim Henderson was a quiet man who worked nights at the hospital. His wife Sarah, a part-time teacher with kind eyes and worry lines that seemed to have deepened since I moved in. "We heard Mrs. Patterson talk to you," Sarah said, glancing around the empty street like a Cold War spy preparing to defect. "We have stories, too. Their tale was particularly cruel." The Hendersons had installed a wheelchair ramp for Jim's elderly father during his extended stay the previous summer. The ramp was temporary, professionally built, and essential for the old man's mobility. Karen had visited them personally to deliver the violation notice. She stood on our front porch, Sarah recalled, her voice shaking with remembered rage, and told us that handicap accessibility wasn't covered under our architectural guidelines, said the ramp was an eyesore that violated community aesthetics. Jim's hands clenched into fists as he continued the story. "My father had just gotten out of the hospital. Couldn't walk without assistance. And this woman is standing there telling us that his wheelchair ramp is going to hurt property values." They had fought the citation, attended board meetings, pleaded their case with dignity and reason. The board had been unmoved. The fine escalated from $50 to $200 to $500. Legal action was threatened. "We ended up paying," Jim said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't risk them putting a lien on our house. Had to take money out of our kids' college fund to make them go away." The ramp had been removed after Jim's father passed away that winter, but the financial and emotional damage remained. The Hendersons had learned the same lesson as Mrs. Patterson. Resistance was futile, and the cost of fighting the board was always higher than the cost of compliance. "But you're fighting them," Sarah said, looking at me with something approaching awe. "You're not backing down." "No," I said simply. "I'm not." Others emerged from the shadows as the days passed. The Garcias had been fined for speaking Spanish too loudly in their own backyard, apparently violating some unwritten noise ordinance that only seemed to apply to conversations. The board couldn't understand. The Johnsons had been cited for their teenage daughter's quinceañera party, accused of hosting an unauthorized commercial event because they had rented tables and a small sound system. The Kellys had faced months of harassment over their vegetable garden, which Karen deemed inappropriate agricultural activity unsuitable for a residential neighborhood. Each story followed the same pattern: arbitrary enforcement of vague rules, escalating fines, and the implicit threat that resistance would only make things worse. The board had created a climate of fear so pervasive that neighbors were afraid to plant flowers without checking the bylaws first. But they had made a critical error in their campaign of intimidation. By targeting me so publicly, by making me the example they intended to use to terrify everyone else, they had inadvertently created something they had never faced before: a focal point for resistance. I became the quiet center of a growing network of documentation and testimony. Neighbors would approach me during carefully choreographed encounters, chance meetings at the grocery store, accidental encounters during morning walks, whispered conversations behind garden sheds and garage doors. Each person brought their own folder of evidence. Each story added another thread to the web of systematic harassment and abuse of authority that the board had woven around the entire community. And I wrote it all down. Every incident, every witness, every document, times, dates, amounts of fines, exact quotes from board members. I organized it all with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 15 years building federal cases against criminal enterprises. Because that's exactly what this was: a criminal enterprise operating under the cover of legitimate authority, using fear and intimidation to extract money from victims who had no realistic means of fighting back. The irony was perfect. While Karen was taking photographs of me near my mailbox, documenting her manufactured trespassing case, I was documenting a pattern of racketeering, extortion, and civil rights violations that would make their petty lawsuit look like a child's tantrum. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was all admissible in federal court. But the most powerful weapon in my growing arsenal wasn't documentation or legal authority. It was hope. For the first time in years, my neighbors were beginning to believe that the board's power wasn't absolute. They were starting to imagine a world where they could plant their gardens, paint their shutters, and invite their grandchildren to visit without fear of retaliation. Mrs. Patterson summed it up perfectly during one of our clandestine meetings behind her garden shed. "I haven't felt this hopeful in years," she said, clutching her folder of evidence like a lifeline. Maybe they're not as powerful as they pretend to be." I smiled at the elderly woman who had suffered so much at the hands of petty tyrants. "Mrs. Patterson," I said, "they're about to learn exactly how powerless they really are." The lawsuit Karen had filed with such confidence was scheduled for hearing in 6 weeks. She probably expected me to spend that time scrambling for a lawyer, begging for mercy, or simply fleeing the neighborhood in defeat. Instead, I spent it building a federal case that would expose their entire operation and give my neighbors the justice they had been denied for years. Every insult Karen had hurled at that community meeting, every lie she had told about my supposed crimes, every moment of intimidation and harassment they had inflicted on innocent people. It was all going to be presented as evidence in a court of law. And when that moment came, I was going to make sure the whole neighborhood was watching. The Riverside County Courthouse smelled of justice and fear in equal measure. Polished marble floors that reflected the morning light, the bitter aroma of coffee from nervous lawyers clutching paper cups, and the underlying mustiness of old legal documents that had witnessed decades of human drama. I arrived early, partly out of habit, and partly to observe the battlefield where Karen's arrogance would finally meet its match. The corridors echoed with the click of heels on marble, the whispered consultations between attorneys and clients, and the soft shuffle of papers being organized for presentation to judges who held the power to change lives with a single ruling. Courtroom 3B was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches that looked like church pews and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room like an altar to justice, the American flag hanging limply beside the California state colors. Karen arrived with the confidence of a general leading her troops into what she believed would be a rout. She swept through the courtroom doors in a sharp navy suit, her expensive briefcase swinging at her side like a weapon, her heels announcing her presence with military precision. Tom and Diane flanked her like loyal adjutants, both dressed in their finest courthouse attire and carrying matching folders stuffed with what they believed was overwhelming evidence. Their lawyer, a thin man with nervous eyes and a rumpled suit, looked less confident than his clients. He kept glancing through his notes, his brow furrowed with the expression of someone who suspected this case might not be as straightforward as he had been led to believe. The gallery began to fill as the morning progressed. Word had spread through Pine Brook Estates that this would be the final confrontation between the HOA board and their most notorious resident. Neighbors arrived in clusters, some supporting Karen's campaign of law and order, others hoping to witness the downfall of their tormentors. Mrs. Patterson sat in the third row, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes bright with anticipation. The Hendersons occupied the seats behind her, holding hands like they were preparing to witness either a miracle or a disaster. Even the Garcias had come, despite their usual reluctance to draw attention to themselves. Karen noticed the crowd and practically preened with satisfaction. This was her moment of triumph, the public vindication of her leadership that would cement her authority over the neighborhood for years to come. She leaned over to whisper something to Tom, who checked his gold watch and nodded with smug approval. Judge Miranda Vasquez entered at precisely 9:02 a.m., her black robes flowing behind her as she took her place at the bench. She was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense expression of someone who had seen every type of human foolishness parade through her courtroom over the years. "Good morning," she said, settling into her chair and surveying the packed gallery with mild interest. "This is the matter of Pine Brook Estates Homeowners Association versus Michael Chen. Let's proceed." Karen's lawyer stood first, his nervous energy barely contained as he launched into his opening presentation. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of repeated trespassing and harassment by a defendant who has shown complete disregard for community standards and Homeowners Association authority." He gestured toward a poster board, covered with photographs, Karen's surveillance images of me, standing near the mailbox cluster, trimming my hedge, working in my own yard. Each photo was carefully labeled with dates and times, creating the impression of a criminal investigation into serious wrongdoing. The defendant, Michael Chen, has repeatedly and willfully trespassed on association property, despite numerous warnings and official citations. He has damaged community assets, intimidated board members in the lawful execution of their duties, and created an atmosphere of hostility that threatens the peaceful enjoyment of property for all residents. Karen leaned forward in her seat, savoring every word. Tom adjusted his gold watch, probably timing the duration of their expected victory. Diane took notes on her clipboard, documenting what she assumed would be my public humiliation. The lawyer continued for nearly 20 minutes, painting me as a rogue homeowner whose criminal behavior justified the most serious legal intervention. He cited precedent cases, quoted HOA bylaws, and referenced property surveys with the authority of someone presenting an airtight case to a jury of my peers. Therefore, Your Honor, we request that the court find the defendant guilty of trespassing, award damages for community property repair, and issue a permanent injunction preventing any future violations of association rules and regulations. He sat down with obvious satisfaction, confident that he had just delivered a knockout blow. Judge Vasquez turned to me with the weary expression of someone who had heard similar HOA disputes countless times before. "Mr. Chen, how do you respond to these charges?" I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes watching my every movement. Karen's smile was triumphant, already savoring her victory. Tom's camera hung around his neck like a trophy. Diane's pen was poised to document my defeat. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the small courtroom. "Before I address the specific allegations, I believe the court should be aware of something that may be relevant to these proceedings." I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the badge, holding it up so the morning light caught the federal eagle and made it shine like a beacon. The silence that followed was thunderous. "I am Special Agent Michael Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation," I continued, placing the badge on the defendant's table where everyone in the courtroom could see it clearly. "I have been a federal law enforcement officer for 15 years, and these allegations represent a systematic campaign of harassment against a federal agent by individuals operating under color of authority." The gasps that rippled through the courtroom sounded like wind through autumn leaves. Karen's face went white, then red, then white again. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his camera, then froze as he realized that photographing a federal agent might not be the wisest course of action. Diane's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Judge Vasquez leaned forward, her expression shifting from mild interest to sharp attention. "Agent Chen," she said, her voice taking on a formal tone that hadn't been present before, "are you suggesting that these proceedings constitute harassment of a federal officer?" "I am, Your Honor. The evidence shows a clear pattern of stalking, surveillance, and intimidation tactics designed to force me from my legally purchased residence. The photographs presented as evidence actually document systematic harassment by the plaintiffs, including unauthorized surveillance of my personal activities and repeated trespassing on my private property to conduct warrantless searches." Karen's lawyer looked like he was about to be sick. He leaned over to whisper frantically with his clients, but Karen was staring at my badge with the expression of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. I continued, my voice calm and professional as I laid out the case I had been building for months. "The plaintiffs have engaged in a conspiracy to deprive me of my civil rights under color of their HOA authority. They have conducted surveillance operations against a federal agent, filed false claims in this court based on manufactured evidence, and coordinated a campaign of intimidation that violates multiple federal statutes." I pulled out my own folder, thicker than theirs, more organized, backed by 15 years of federal law enforcement experience. I have documented evidence of their pattern of harassment, including photographs of the plaintiffs conducting unauthorized searches of my property, recordings of their threats made during public meetings, and testimony from multiple witnesses who have been similarly targeted by this criminal conspiracy. Word criminal hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. "Judge!" Vasquez was no longer looking at this as a simple HOA dispute. Her expression had shifted to the serious focus of someone who realized they might be dealing with federal crimes in their local courtroom. "Agent Chen," she said carefully, "are you filing counterclaims against the plaintiffs?" "Not in this court, Your Honor. This matter falls under federal jurisdiction due to the targeting of a federal officer. I will be referring all evidence to the appropriate federal authorities for investigation and prosecution." In that moment, the board realized they hadn't just sued a neighbor who stood too close to a mailbox. They had sued the federal government. Karen found her voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual commanding tone. "Your Honor, we had no idea. We never. This is just a simple homeowners association matter." Judge Vasquez silenced her with a look that could have frozen boiling water. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, using Karen's formal name for the first time, "are you telling this court that you filed harassment charges against a federal law enforcement officer without conducting even basic due diligence about his background?" The courtroom held its breath. Every neighbor who had ever received one of Karen's violation notices, every resident who had been intimidated by Tom's surveillance drives, every person who had lived in fear of Diane's informant network, They all watched as their tormentors finally faced consequences. The bylaws clearly state, Karen stammered, but the words died in her throat as she realized that all her carefully memorized regulations meant nothing in the face of federal authority. Judge Vasquez turned back to me, her expression professional but not unsympathetic. Agent Chen, in light of these revelations, how would you like to proceed? I looked across the courtroom at the three people who had made my life miserable for months, who had terrorized my neighbors for years, who had turned a peaceful community into their personal kingdom of fear and intimidation. Your Honor, I said, I request that all charges against me be dismissed with prejudice, and that this court refer the matter to federal authorities for investigation of civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive a federal officer of his constitutional rights, and abuse of process. The silence stretched like a held breath until Judge Vasquez brought her gavel, down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. All charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed with prejudice. This court finds no merit whatsoever in the plaintiff's claims and notes serious concerns about the methods used to gather evidence and the motivation behind these proceedings. She looked directly at Karen, Tom, and Diane, her expression conveying the weight of judicial authority. Furthermore, this court will indeed be referring this matter to federal authorities for review. The plaintiffs are advised to retain competent legal counsel immediately. The gallery erupted in whispers and scattered applause. Mrs. Patterson was crying with relief. The Hendersons were holding each other like survivors of a natural disaster. Even the Garcias were smiling, probably for the first time since Karen had become HOA president. Karen sat frozen in her chair, staring at the badge on my table as if it were a venomous snake. Tom had gone completely pale, his gold watch suddenly looking more like a shackle than a symbol of success. Diane was gathering her papers with shaking hands, her network of informants suddenly seeming like evidence of conspiracy rather than community involvement. Their lawyer was already backing away from the table, clearly calculating how quickly he could distance himself from clients who had just exposed him to potential federal liability. As the courtroom began to clear, I walked over to the plaintiff's table. Karen looked up at me with eyes that had lost all their arrogance, replaced by the dawning realization of how completely she had miscalculated. For what it's worth, I said quietly, so only the three of them could hear, I came to Pinebrook Estates to retire from this kind of work. I just wanted to be a good neighbor. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. We didn't know. No, I agreed. You didn't, but that's not the problem. The problem is that you didn't care who you were hurting, as long as you got to feel powerful. I picked up my badge and slipped it back into my pocket. The very people who tried to strip me of my dignity just walked, outstripped of their own authority, and, for the first time in months, the halls of justice actually smelled like justice. The aftermath of the courtroom revelation spread through Pinebrook Estates like wildfire through dry grass. By the time I returned home that afternoon, the entire neighborhood buzzed with the kind of electric energy that follows a lightning strike. Shocking, transformative, and impossible to ignore. Karen's house sat dark and silent across the street, her usually pristine driveway empty except for fallen leaves that no one had bothered to sweep. The proud HOA board member sign that had stood like a monument to her authority now seemed like a relic from a bygone era, its bright lettering already looking faded and meaningless. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for me by my mailbox, her face glowing with a mixture of joy and disbelief that made her look 20 years younger. Michael, she said, using my first name for the first time since I'd moved in. I can't believe what happened today. A federal agent! All this time, we had a federal agent living right here, and they were stupid enough to sue you. Her laughter was bright and musical, the sound of someone who had carried fear for so long that its sudden absence felt like floating. The look on Karen's face when you showed that badge. I'll remember that moment for the rest of my life. Other neighbors began emerging from their houses like prairie dogs after a storm. The Hendersons walked over from across the street, no longer glancing nervously at Karen's windows. The Garcias approached from their house next door, their teenage daughter trailing behind with the curious expression of someone witnessing history. "Is it true?" Jim Henderson asked, his voice filled with the wonder of a man who had watched David face Goliath and lived to see the giant fall. "Are they really going to be investigated by the FBI?" "Federal authorities will review all the evidence," I confirmed. "Everything they did to me, everything they did to all of you, it's all going to be examined under federal law." The implications hung in the air like smoke from celebration fireworks. For years, these people had lived under the tyranny of three individuals who had convinced them that resistance was futile, that compliance was their only option, that the board's authority was absolute and unquestionable. Now, they were learning that their tormentors were just ordinary people who had been exposed to the real consequences of their actions for the first time in their lives. "What happens now?" Sarah Henderson asked. "To the HOA, I mean. To all of us?" It was a reasonable question. The board that had ruled their lives with such iron authority was about to cease to exist, leaving a vacuum that would need to be filled. The bylaws provide for emergency elections when board members are unable to fulfill their duties, I explained. You'll need to elect new leadership, people who actually care about serving the community instead of controlling it. The conversation continued as more neighbors joined our impromptu street gathering. For the first time since I'd moved to Pine Brook Estates, people were talking freely without glancing over their shoulders or lowering their voices when certain names were mentioned. The transformation was remarkable to witness. These same people who had crossed the street to avoid being seen talking to me just hours earlier were now gathered in my front yard, sharing stories of liberation like prisoners comparing notes after their captors had fled. But the real collapse was only beginning. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Tuesday evening, ostensibly to address recent developments affecting board leadership. Karen's signature appeared at the bottom of the notice, but her usually bold handwriting seemed shaky and uncertain. The community center had never hosted such a large crowd. Residents who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years packed the small room to capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding near the doorway. The air crackled with anticipation and barely contained excitement. Karen sat at the head table alone. Tom had resigned via email that morning, citing personal reasons that everyone understood meant legal liability. Diane had simply disappeared. Her house dark, her car gone, her resignation delivered by a neighbor who found an envelope taped to the community center door, the woman who had once commanded this room like a general addressing. Her troops now looked small and diminished behind the folding table. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes, and her usually immaculate clothing seemed wrinkled and hastily assembled. She called the meeting to order with a voice that barely carried to the back of the room. "Given recent circumstances," she began, then stopped and cleared her throat. "Given recent developments, the current board feels it would be in the community's best interest to hold immediate elections for new leadership." A hand shot up from the middle of the room. It was Mrs. Patterson, sitting straighter than I had ever seen her, her voice clear and strong. "Before we discuss elections," she said, "I think this community deserves an explanation for what's been happening here. An apology for the harassment, the illegal fines, the surveillance, and the intimidation tactics that have been used against residents for years." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Other hands went up. Voices that had been silenced by fear for years suddenly found their strength. Jim Henderson stood up without waiting to be recognized. My family paid over $1,000 in bogus fines last year. Fines for a wheelchair ramp my disabled father needed to access our home. We want those fines refunded, and we want a public apology. The Garcias were cited for speaking Spanish in their own backyard, called out another voice. How is that legal? How is that American? What about all the unauthorized searches of our properties? The photographs taken without permission? The threats against anyone who questioned board decisions? Karen sat frozen as the testimony poured forth like water through a broken dam. Story after story of abuse, harassment, and petty tyranny that had been hidden in shame and fear for years was now being exposed to the light. The most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source. Mr. Williams, the quiet accountant who lived on the corner, stood up with a manila folder that looked ominously familiar. "I've been the HOA treasurer for the past 3 years," he announced, his mild voice somehow carrying clearly through the room. "I've been keeping detailed records of all financial transactions, and I think this community needs to know how their money has been spent." He opened the folder and began reading from a prepared statement. In the past 2 years alone, the board has spent over $15,000 in community funds on legal fees for harassment lawsuits against residents, another $8,000 on surveillance equipment that was used to spy on homeowners, $5,000 on professional consulting that appears to have been personal services for board members. The room erupted in angry voices. People who had been struggling to pay Karen's arbitrary fines were discovering that their own HOA dues had been funding the weapons used against them. Furthermore, Mr. Williams continued, there are numerous questionable expenditures that may constitute misuse of community funds. Restaurant bills claimed as board meeting expenses. Travel reimbursements for conferences that appear to have been personal vacations. Equipment purchases that were never delivered to community facilities. Karen's face had gone completely white. The financial misconduct Williams was describing could result in criminal charges beyond the federal civil rights violations already under investigation. "I resign," she said suddenly, her voice cracking like a teenager whose authority had finally been challenged. "Effective immediately, I resign from the board and from all HOA positions." But the room wasn't finished with her. Mrs. Patterson stood up again, and this time her voice carried the authority of someone who had survived years of oppression and lived to see justice served. "Resignation isn't enough," she declared. "This community has been terrorized for years by people who abused their authority and violated our rights. We demand a full audit of HOA finances, restitution for all illegal fines, and a complete restructuring of how this association operates." The applause was thunderous. For the first time in years, the residents of Pinebrook Estates were exercising their own authority, taking back control of their community from the petty dictators who had held them hostage. Karen gathered her papers with shaking hands and walked toward the door. As she passed my seat, she paused for just a moment. "I hope you're satisfied," she whispered, her voice filled with the bitterness of someone who had never learned to accept responsibility for her actions. "I hope you learned something," I replied quietly. She left without another word, walking out of the community center and effectively out of the neighborhood's life. Her house would go up for sale 2 weeks later, and she would disappear from Pinebrook Estates as completely as if she had never existed. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as the community began the process of healing and rebuilding. Emergency elections were scheduled. A financial audit was authorized. A victims' compensation fund was established to refund illegal fines and fees. Most importantly, new bylaws were drafted with strict limitations on board authority and clear protections for residents' rights. As people filed out of the community center that night, the atmosphere was completely different from any HOA meeting in years. Instead of fear and tension, there was hope and possibility. Instead of whispered conversations and nervous glances, there was open discussion and shared planning. Mrs. Patterson walked with me toward our houses, her step lighter than it had been in years. "You know," she said, looking up at the clear night sky, "I had forgotten what it felt like to live without fear. To know that my home was actually mine, that I could plant flowers or paint my shutters, or invite my grandson to visit, without worrying about retaliation." I looked around at the quiet neighborhood, the same streets and houses and mailbox, clusters that had been the sites of so much conflict and harassment. But everything felt different now, as if the very air had been cleansed of toxicity. "It's going to take time," I told her. "Communities don't heal overnight from this kind of systematic abuse." "But they can heal," she said with conviction. "And maybe the next family that moves here will get to experience what this place was supposed to be all along, a real community where neighbors look out for each other instead of reporting on each other." The very people who tried to strip me of my dignity had walked out stripped of their own authority, their power revealed as the hollow construct it had always been. And in their absence, something much more valuable was beginning to grow, the possibility of genuine community built on respect rather than fear. Spring came early to Pine Brook Estates that year, and with it, a transformation that went far deeper than the daffodils pushing through, the thawed earth or the dogwood trees budding with promises of beauty to come. The neighborhood breathed again. I could hear the difference. In the morning air, children's laughter spilling from backyards, where parents no longer worried about noise, violations, the friendly conversations between neighbors who had rediscovered the simple pleasure of talking over fence lines, the sound of lawnmowers running at times that suited their owners rather than conforming to arbitrary HOA schedules. Mrs. Patterson's garden had exploded into a riot of color that would have sent the old board into apoplectic fury. Bright red tulips mixed with yellow daffodils and purple crocuses in glorious defiance of the approved color palette that had once dictated every flowering plant in the neighborhood. She tended them each morning with the satisfaction of someone exercising long-denied freedom. "They're beautiful," I told her one April morning as we both collected our mail from the cluster that had once been a battlefield. Her smile was radiant. "Karen would have cited me for non-compliant landscaping if she could see this," she said, gesturing at the spectacular display. "But you know what? I don't care. These are the flowers I should have been planting all along." The Hendersons had reinstalled their wheelchair ramp, not for Jim's father, who had passed away during the dark days of the old regime, but as a permanent fixture that spoke to their commitment to accessibility and human dignity. They had painted it a cheerful blue that complemented their house perfectly and violated at least 3 of Karen's former aesthetic guidelines. "We're not taking it down again," Sarah had declared at the first meeting of the new democratically elected HOA board. "If someone needs accessibility in this neighborhood, they're going to have it without having to fight bureaucrats or pay extortion fees." The new board was everything the old one had never been: representative, responsive, and focused on service rather than control. Mrs. Patterson had been elected president by unanimous vote, her years of suffering under the previous regime having given her both the credibility and the motivation to ensure that such abuse never happened again. The financial audit had revealed the full extent of Karen's mismanagement and possible criminal activity. Over $30,000 in community funds had been misspent on personal expenses, frivolous lawsuits, and surveillance equipment that violated residents' privacy rights. Federal investigators were still working through the evidence, but early indications suggested that criminal charges were likely. More importantly, the audit had allowed the new board to establish a victims' compensation fund that refunded every illegal fine and fee that had been levied over the previous 4 years. Families who had drained their savings to pay Karen's arbitrary penalties were finally made whole. The psychological healing took longer but was perhaps more significant. Neighbors who had lived in fear for years slowly rediscovered the courage to express themselves, to improve their homes according to their own tastes, to live without constantly looking over their shoulders for clipboard-carrying enforcers. The Garcias had painted their house a warm terracotta color that reflected their heritage and their personalities. Their teenage daughter had started a community garden in the small park area that had previously been off-limits to residents, and families throughout the neighborhood contributed vegetables and flowers to the shared space. Even simple activities that had been sources of anxiety under the old regime became celebrations of freedom. The Johnsons held another quinceañera for their youngest daughter, this time without fear of citations or fines. The music and laughter lasted well into the evening, and instead of complaints, neighbors brought dishes to share and joined the celebration. The community center, which had once been the site of intimidation and fear, was transformed into a genuine gathering place. The new board held meetings that were actually about community improvement rather than resident control. People volunteered for committees because they wanted to help their neighbors, not because they were afraid of retaliation. My own role in the neighborhood's transformation had evolved in ways I never expected. The revelation of my federal law enforcement background had initially made some residents nervous. They had lived under surveillance for so long that the presence of any kind of authority figure triggered anxiety. But as the months passed, people began to understand that real authority was different from the petty tyranny they had experienced. Real authority was about protecting people, not controlling them. It was about serving others, not serving yourself. It was about justice, not revenge. I found myself consulting informally on community safety issues, helping neighbors understand their rights, and occasionally mediating disputes with the patience of someone who had dealt with far more serious conflicts. But mostly, I was just a neighbor who happened to have experience in law enforcement, someone who could offer guidance when needed, but who respected everyone's autonomy and dignity. The federal investigation had concluded 6 months after the courthouse confrontation. Karen and Tom were indicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, abuse of process, and misappropriation of funds. Diane had avoided prosecution by cooperating fully with investigators and providing evidence about the board's systematic harassment campaigns. Karen's trial was scheduled for the following fall. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Not just the harassment campaign against me, but years of documented civil rights violations against dozens of residents. Legal experts predicted that she would face significant prison time if convicted. Tom had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for cooperation and community service. His gold watch and expensive camera had been seized as proceeds of illegal activity, a detail that somehow felt like perfect justice. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond Pine Brook Estates. Legal precedents were being established that would protect homeowners across the country from similar abuse by HOA boards. Federal authorities were reviewing HOA governance practices nationwide, and several states were considering legislation that would provide clearer oversight and accountability for homeowners associations. But for me, the most meaningful changes were the small, daily ones. The smell of pine trees at dawn was no longer mixed with the anxiety of wondering what violation notice might be waiting in my mailbox. The quiet hum of cicadas was no longer interrupted by the sound of unauthorized footsteps in my backyard or the click of surveillance cameras. The freedom of space that had originally drawn me to this house was finally, fully mine. I could sit on my front porch with my morning coffee and watch my neighbors going about their lives without fear. Could wave to Mrs. Patterson as she tended her magnificent, non-compliant garden. Could nod to the Hendersons as they used their beautiful blue wheelchair ramp. Could smile at the Garcia children playing in their backyard, speaking whatever language brought them joy. This was what community was supposed to feel like. Not a prison where conformity was enforced through fear, but a place where different people could live together in mutual respect and shared purpose. One evening in late summer, As I was watering the flower boxes that had once been the subject of violation notices, Mrs. Patterson approached with something in her hands. "I wanted to show you this," she said, holding out a letter with official federal letterhead. "It's from the Justice Department." The letter was brief but powerful. "Dear Mrs. Patterson, your courage in coming forward with evidence of civil rights violations in your community has contributed to a successful federal prosecution that will protect homeowners throughout the country. Your willingness to speak truth to power, despite years of intimidation and harassment, exemplifies the best of American civic engagement. Thank you for your service to justice." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were bright with tears as I handed the letter back to her. "I never thought I was being brave," she said. "I was just so tired of being afraid." "That's exactly what courage is," I told her. "Doing the right thing, even when you're afraid." She smiled and looked around at the neighborhood that had become home again for all of us. "Your moving here changed everything," she said. "If you hadn't fought back, if you hadn't shown us that they weren't as powerful as they pretended to be, we'd still be living under their thumb." I shook my head. "I just provided the opportunity. All of you provided the courage. You were the ones who came forward with evidence, who testified, who demanded justice. You were the ones who transformed this community." As the sun set over Pinebrook Estates that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that no HOA aesthetic committee could have improved upon, I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this moment. Karen Whitmore and her board had thought they could use a piece of paper to destroy me, to drive me from my home, and make me an example that would terrify anyone else who might consider challenging their authority. They had miscalculated everything: my background, my resources, my willingness to fight back, and most importantly, the deep well of courage that existed in the neighbors they had been oppressing for years. In the end, all it had taken to bring down their entire system of fear and intimidation was a piece of metal, small, heavy, and stamped with the truth of real authority used in service of justice rather than personal power. The badge had been my weapon, but it had never been the real source of my strength. Real strength had come from the same place it always came from in America, from ordinary people who refused to accept that bullying and intimidation were the price of living in community with others, from neighbors who chose courage over compliance, justice over quiet suffering, and hope over fear. From the simple, revolutionary idea that home should be a place of safety and dignity for everyone, not just those with the power to enforce their will on others. The very people who had tried to strip me of my dignity had learned that real dignity comes not from the power to control others, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. And in learning that lesson, some the hard way, others through witnessing justice served, an entire community had reclaimed not just their neighborhood, but their faith in the possibility that America could still be a place where truth and justice prevailed over fear and intimidation. The wind picked up as darkness settled over Pinebrook Estates, carrying with it the scent of Mrs. Patterson's magnificent flowers, the sound of children playing without fear, and the quiet satisfaction of a community that had remembered what it meant to be truly free.